All right, friends, it's my opportunity to introduce myself to y'all for the first time for some, second, third, maybe a couple more for some of you. My name's Lickliter. I'm the director of youth ministry just down the hall at First Presbyterian Church. And I'm truly blessed to be here with y'all this morning. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share in this time with you. I have a tradition at First Pres because I work specifically with those between the ages of 12 or 6th grade all the way up until, we'll call it 30s, early 30s, because I work with the young adults as well as the youth of our church. And so it's my job to tell the folks who sit in the pews, like y'all, a little bit about myself, because I think in order for this relationship to work, in order for any of the things that I hope to share with you today, we need to have some rapport with one another. So, growing up, I was, if you read through the little blurb that's in the back of your bulletin this morning, you'll see that I was born in Wheaton, Illinois. I was born to Craig and Lisa Lickliter, two wonderful parents, and my father is a big athlete, okay? I was raised to play basketball because of my height. I ran cross country and track. We were forced to play sports or participate in some kind of after-school activity so that my sister and I didn't get out of line. My sister was always in line. It was me that was getting into trouble. But in the off season, when we moved to New Jersey, we started going on an annual ski trip on New Year's. We would go up to Vermont, and we'd spend the holiday skiing. And it was beautiful. And I got this great idea when I moved down to the south that I needed to show the young people of Columbus, Georgia, what real snow looks like. And so the first year and a half here at Columbus, First Pres, I gathered some of our students together and we drove in the bus to Boone, North Carolina. And we went on our inaugural ski trip. Now, a ski trip is structured in a very intentional way. Day number one is horrendous. It is awful. Because, as you can expect, there's one person, me, that has skied before in their life, and everybody else has no idea what they're doing. Have y'all ever experienced anything like this where you've signed up to participate in some kind of an activity and you have no idea what you signed yourself up for? Now imagine yourself being 6th, 7th, 8th grade, maybe even a freshman in high school, and that's exactly where you're at. And you're trapped for 2 days doing this thing. You have no choice. So I gather these young people, we drive out, we're on the mountain, we're having this fantastic day. Fantastic for me because I'm doing something that I love and I've spent years crafting my skill at. These young people are not having the best time, right? But that's to be expected. Day one is awful. You're battered and bruised, you come home, you're disappointed. We have a wonderful devotional the next morning while we watch the sun come up and we look at the majesty of God's creation and we talk about how, our problems seem so small when we have the opportunity to just take a breath and look at the wonderful things that God has blessed us with. And then you go out, and all of a sudden, these things that you learned the day before, they start coming together, and all of a sudden, you're going down the mountain, and instead of just struggling to slide down on your bottom from the ski slope where you got off the lift, instead now maybe you're going up 3/4 of the way to the top of the mountain, and you're going down, and everybody is having a blast. Now, what if I told you Day 2 didn't go according to plan at all on this first trip, right? You see, when we got there, when we woke up that morning, I threw the curtains back in our hotel room, or my hotel room, to see that I couldn't see outside the window of the hotel because the wind was blowing the snow that was falling from the sky so hard that it was a whiteout. You couldn't see to the street. You couldn't see across the road. There was nothing, right? And I'm driving a church bus, the one that you might have seen in the side lot a couple of times. And I have to drive up a mountain with this thing. In that moment, I had to make a decision. I recognized that we weren't going to make it up the mountain, right? I'm not going to drive a bus full of young children up this mountain with the potential for us to go slip sliding all the way back down again to our hotel. So instead, I load all the young people onto the bus. We drive down the road slowly. They're all a Twitter because they're trying to figure out what crazy plan I'm going to come up with them to spend the rest of their day doing. We drive out to the Walmart, and we buy a bunch of board games. And we end up squatting at the hotel because there's nowhere else we can go. We're playing Monopoly, we're playing checkers, chess, what have you, all of these things. But in order to get back to the hotel, I have to drive the bus out of the church or out of the Walmart parking lot. And so we're driving, right? Pulling out slowly, as I mentioned before. They had done a wonderful job of clearing the parking lot. And so I roll out, and we're getting ready to head back to the hotel. And I put my foot on the gas, only to find that the bus is no longer moving. Hit the gas pedal again, nothing. The bus is on. There's not a problem. The bus is working. I hop out to find that I have driven the bus into a snowdrift. It's stuck. I have, in this moment, no one to blame but myself, right? I am frustrated because I'm doing the best that I can to try and come up with some kind of a plan for these young people to do something with their day, because my plan was thwarted by the weather. So I hop out of the bus, and I'm hot, right? Not just angry hot, but temperature hot. That's how frustrated and angry I am. And I'm talking to God this whole time saying, what the heck are we doing here? Because I have nothing else. We're stuck here at this Walmart. I know no one. All these children are looking at me. I get back on the bus to try and go and find a snow shovel, because I keep one in the back of the bus. That's the training of being born to two Midwesterners. Always be prepared. And at this point, young Mr. Walker Bridges, one of our seniors this year at First Pres, looks me dead in the eyes and says, why did you do that? Why did you drive the bus into the snow? What are you doing? And he's trying to be funny. He knows just the right buttons to press. And that didn't help my frustration or my anger in that moment. I walked past him silently to go grab the snow shovel, got off the bus, started shoveling the bus out. And wouldn't you know, that same boy who was giving me a hard time about parking the bus in the middle of a snowdrift is the only one that hops off that bus and helps me to dig that bus out again. I'm telling you this story because I don't think it's that uncommon for any of us, for us to be headed down one path. For us, it was day 2 of this ski trip. And all of a sudden, our plans get squashed, or we recognize that we're headed in the wrong direction, as I did when I parked that bus in the middle of a 4.5-foot tall snowdrift in the Walmart parking lot. And it's today in our text in the story of Jonah that we find the story of a man who is also headed the wrong direction, right? How many of us are familiar with this story? Yeah? Kiddos in the back, do we know about the story of Jonah and the fish? Maybe? Yes? All right. That's the story that I know also. I'm familiar with the middle and beginning part of the story, right? So let's run through it quickly. What happens in the very beginning? We just read through the first 3 verses together. Jonah hears from God that he is to go to the city of Nineveh and help these people to see that they are not living their lives in the way that God has called them to. Is that right? We're getting the gist? What happens next? Do we know? Does he go to Nineveh? No. We're adamantly shaking our head in the back. No, he doesn't. In fact, he goes almost as far in the opposite direction that he can. If you do a little bit of research, if you look at some ancient maps of the world, Tarshish is not close to Nineveh. They're not hanging out like Phoenix City and Columbus, Georgia are. He has to hop on this boat to go in the exact opposite direction of the way that God has called him to go. I don't know about y'all, but there have been some instances in my life where I have headed in the wrong direction from where it is that God has sent me directly. It's interesting to me as we think about who Jonah is, because Jonah is serving an interesting role as a prophet, right? Jonah is the mouthpiece of God. He is speaking on behalf of God, the Most High, and yet he doesn't listen. I find that to be a little bit encouraging for me personally, because as I shared with y'all, I mess up a good bit of the time. So begins a story full of rhythms. This story of Jonah is a unique one because it subverts our expectations. We're going into this story knowing that Jonah is supposed to proclaim this important message to these people. But we find out that Jonah is not who we thought that he was very early on. He does the opposite of what it is that God has called him to do. He hops on a boat headed in the opposite direction, west instead of east. And God responds, how? What happens next? Jonah's on the boat. He's going the wrong way. What happens? A big storm, right? It's not calm. If you're on a boat and it's in the middle of the ocean and all of a sudden this crazy storm whips up, lightning flashing, thunder's crashing, there's clouds everywhere, the waves are real big, how are we feeling? Good, bad? Seasick? Me too. If it gets rough, I do okay as long as the water's calm. But again, we find these expectations are changed for us. Because you see, Jonah, once again, man of God, supposed to have it all figured out, all together, supposed to do what it is that God tells him. He's on this boat doing the exact opposite of what we expect him to do, of what God has told him to do. And we find out that there's these sailors on the boat with him. Yeah? Are they people of God? Are they Israelite people? No. But what do? Do we know what happens next in the story when the storm is raging all around them? The sailors fall to their knees and pray. They cry out to God. They do the opposite of what we would expect them to do in the story, right? These people who don't know God all of a sudden do one of the most humbling acts in falling to their knees on the decks of a boat. I can probably count on one hand the times I have fallen on my knees, and I have been a follower of Jesus my entire life. I was born into the church. I continue to serve the church at 31 years old, and I plan to do so long into my future. But I look at these characters, and I think that this story is goofy. It's wonky. The characters are doing things that we wouldn't expect them to do. And then Jonah gets it together, right? Jonah says, guys, it's my fault. God is angry at me because I didn't listen. And so he goes to the sailors and he says, throw me overboard and the storm will calm. We kind of dust over that part a little bit, in my children's storybook Bible at least. Because if we think about it, is Jonah's act of being cast overboard an act of contrition? Do we think that Jonah recognizes the error of his ways in that moment? Or if looking at the way that Jonah has run away from and ignored God's call, is it more likely that Jonah is just doing the same old thing? He's avoiding that thing that God has called him to do. By jumping overboard, he's no longer going to be able to go to Nineveh and proclaim the gospel, right? Interesting. Again, not something that I would expect from a prophet of the Lord, let alone to be present in the Bible. And so, the sailors cast Jonah overboard. And what happens next when he hits the waves? Do we know? The whale. Very good. Very, very good. So this fish comes up and swallows Jonah up. Your Bible, or your children's storybook Bible, or if you're more familiar with the VeggieTales version of this story, it might say a big fish. And we've arrived at one of the reasons for the title of today's sermon, Bovines and Baleen. You see, whales have baleen instead of teeth, and they use baleen to filter out the krill. I'm curious as to whether or not Jonah got caught up on the way down. Something to explore at a later date, not while we're in the middle of worship. Anyways, God foils Jonah's plans to escape Nineveh, the charge that God gave him, by providing a strange, watery tomb for him, the stomach of a large fish. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant certain death, right? I read a story earlier this year called Whale Fall. It was the story of a young man that's going to reconcile the troubled relationship that he had with his father. And his dad was a big scuba diver. And so he goes down and he's exploring the depths of the ocean. And as he's down there, a squid rushes past him and a whale ascends from the depths on its pursuit of eating this squid and swallows up the young man. And the story begins at that moment. And it's this intense drama of a story of survival as this young man is trying to work his way out of the belly of a whale. And I just wonder as I'm reading through this story, and I don't know if any of y'all have wondered the same thing, why so much of this story is left for us to wonder about. I want to hear more about what was going on between Jonah and God while he was in the belly of the whale. We hear about Jonah praying and crying out to God, but it's an interesting prayer because it's not what I would expect, once again. It's not a man who recognizes the error of his ways and is asking for forgiveness and is crying out to God because he's so sorry and all of these things. Instead, he's crying out to God simply to be rescued. He promises to obey God from this point on, no matter what. And how does God respond? He has the fish vomit Jonah back up onto the beach. Finally, we've arrived at the bulk of where we're going to rest for the remainder of today. We've arrived in Nineveh with Jonah. Jonah shows up and delivers his message. In the text, it's very brief. 40 more days and Nineveh shall be overturned. It's kind of a weird sermon. Looking at the time, I'm sorry that today's sermon is not as short as Jonah's. I hope that you'll forgive me. But I think that it's important that we take a little bit of extra time to linger here and unpack what it is that Jonah is saying, or what the book of Jonah is saying. Because Jonah's words are a bit odd. They're missing some things. There's no mention of what exactly it is that the Ninevites have done wrong or what they should do in response to the error of their ways. There's no mention of God. What's going on here? Has Jonah intentionally given the bare minimum of information? Is he trying to sabotage his own message? It's almost like he's trying to ensure the destruction of this group of people that have antagonized not only himself, but the people of Israel for a long, long time. He's trying to ensure their destruction, or so it would seem, as there's no effort on his part to try and provide real guidance for these people. No sooner does he utter his 5-word sermon than the king of Nineveh and the entire city, including their cows, second part of the title today, all repent in sorrow, and they're covered in ash. These evil pagans, not unlike the sailors that were on the boat with Jonah earlier, show themselves to be more responsive and faithful than God's own prophet. God forgives the Ninevites and does not bring destruction down on the city. I think that there's a brilliant little nugget here in the text this morning. The last word of Jonah's short sermon, overturned, in the original Hebrew has a couple of different meanings. You see, it can mean simply to turn over, meaning that it can refer to a city being overthrown or destroyed, like Sodom was in Genesis chapter 19, verse 21. But it can also be used to mean transformation, something being turned over and changed into its opposite. So ironically, in spite of his little effort to actually help the people of Nineveh, Jonah's words did come true, but perhaps not in the way that he had intended originally. Nineveh gets turned over as Jonah's enemies repent and find God's mercy. Now we're almost at the finish line. Jonah is angry with God in chapter 4 because God has saved the evil people of Nineveh. He first tells God why he ran away back in chapter 1. It wasn't because he was afraid, but because he knew that God is kind and merciful. He knows that God is compassionate and would find a way to forgive those horrible Ninevites. Jonah is outraged that God would find satisfaction and love for his enemies. You can almost hear the disgust in Jonah's voice before he cuts off the conversation and prays that God would just kill him on the spot. He'd rather die than live with a God who forgives his enemies. What a reaction from the prophet of the Lord. The reason that I said that the story of Jonah is much more than just the story of Jonah and the whale is because of this next part. I think that there's a lesson to be learned here. And it's odd, the way that God teaches us, and in this instant teaches Jonah. God provides a vine plant to grow up and shade Jonah from the sun, which makes him quite happy. But then God sends a tiny worm to eat the plant, and Jonah loses his shade and is immediately outraged. In the heat of the sun, Jonah asks again that God would kill him. And God asks Jonah a second time if his anger is in fact justified. Jonah barks back, "Absolutely, just let me die." And those are the last words that we hear from Jonah in the book of his own name. It's God who speaks the final words of this book. God says that the whole vine incident was an attempt to get through to Jonah, to break through his hard-headedness. He got emotional over a withered vine that he had only been able to enjoy and known for less than a day. But God asks, aren't human beings a bit more valuable than vines? Isn't it okay if God feels the same emotional intensity and concern for the city of Nineveh, full of thousands of people who have lost their way? The book ends here with God asking Jonah for permission to show mercy to his enemies and their cows. Jonah's answer? Well, the story doesn't say, because that's not really the point. The point, I believe, that this book is trying to tell us through subverting our expectations is that God has a question for us that's addressed to all of us gathered here today, all of us who are followers of Jesus. Are we okay with the fact that God does in fact love our enemies? I can't help but take this opportunity to touch on something that has been stuck in my head for the last week or so. You see, I love the Olympics. Have you all been watching the things happening overseas in Paris? I missed the front end of things because I had to make an emergency trip to Indianapolis. And I've been trying to play catch-up the whole time. I don't know about you, but when I got home and I finally threw on the TV and hopped on the computer and walked my way through the sea of social media, I was disappointed to see that the first thing I saw was not excitement about the things that are going on with Team USA, how they've been competing, or support for the athletes that are putting on for our great nation. Instead, I hopped online and I was bombarded with anger and outrage, not all that different from the experience and the voice that we hear in Jonah in the text today. People that I care about, friends and family members, were reacting similarly to Jonah, to the opening ceremonies. My goal is not today to tell you how you ought to feel in response to what was portrayed in Paris a few days ago, but instead to ask a question, same as the text does in Jonah. I've dropped a couple of references in the sermon today to the fruits of the Spirit here, and it may surprise you to hear that those characteristics that I've used, those traits, are not used to describe Jonah. Instead, the fruits of the Spirit that I've used in the sermon today were used to apply to the sailors of that ship that Jonah was on, and they were also used to apply to the people of Nineveh in the way that they respond to God's call. Friends, we are given a choice, like Jonah, to join in God's plan, to be molded and reshaped by the gospel, to be a people living in hope and embodying the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. How different would the world be today if the Big C church were known for these things rather than outrage, like Jonah? Today we have encountered two call stories in the text: the call of Jonah to follow God's direction to aid in the redemption of the Assyrian city of Nineveh, and the second being in the calling of the Ninevites and their cows to change their ways and to worship the God of Israel. But I believe that there's a third call nestled in the text, one for each of us to consider today. We are each called, like Jonah, to proclaim the good news of Jesus to the world. There may be people that don't fit our criteria. If I'm being honest, there's a little Jonah in me, where I say, really, God, even them? Where we are called to live into the fruits of the Spirit found in Galatians, rather than to give in to our outrage and to our fear. The story of Jonah is one that ought to cause us to do some introspection, some self-reflection, to realize that we are more like Jonah than we'd like to admit, running from the things that God has called us to. But we serve a God that loves us and has set a table that is big and wide and has plenty of room for everyone to gather in love and in community with one another. Let us join together in celebrating the invitation that is given to all of creation. Let us answer our shared call to serve God and to truly love one another. Alleluia. Amen.